almost all of you had it all done. Most of you had it mostly done. So we checked the study guide. You did good. We're going to move on to several different topics today. So we're going to finish up Civil War medicine, talking about a new kind of technology that's creepy and gory and weird. But we still use it today, so that's kind of interesting. And then we'll move into another new kind of technology, a warfare technology called Ironclads, ships made of metal. We've talked about one in the past, but it wasn't really an ironclad. It was just called Old Ironside. So we'll come back and see if you have any memory of that. I'll prompt you to that so you can be thinking about Old Ironsides and where you've heard of that before. And then we'll also talk about up to this time, up to where we're studying today in American history, the Battle of Shiloh, the bloodiest battle in American history up to that point, the deadliest days, 2-day battle in American history up to that point. It will get worse in the Civil War, but Shiloh is really nasty and ugly. The Battle of Shiloh was briefly mentioned when I showed you a picture of that skinny guy, Charles Nickerson. And I told you he was sick and missed the Battle of Shiloh, which probably meant that he lived, because a lot of people died at Shiloh. So we start to see battles that are taking place more regularly, that are on a much grander scale than anything we could imagine before. The Civil War is a different kind of creature this way. So we see larger numbers of casualties. We see armies that are multiples times greater than the size of the armies that existed in wars before. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and even before the American Revolution. We're talking about a couple thousand soldiers, but we're starting to get into some battles in the American Civil War. When we look at both sides, 120,000 soldiers or more. That's a lot of men that are all shooting at each other. That's a lot of bullets flying through the air. That's a lot of bodies getting killed. So the Civil War isn't even comparable to anything else, at least up to this point in history. We have to go all the way up to World War I before we start seeing casualty figures, at least in our history, that even come close to the casualty figures in some of these battles. And your assignment is to continue working on your study guide. We are only a couple days, maybe 1 or 2 class periods away from Chapter 16 test. So after we finish today, we'll have 2 big ones left, and I think we'll knock them out in one day. So today's Wednesday. Probably on Friday, we're going to get really close to finishing Chapter 16, which then would mean on Tuesday next week, we should be ready to finish and review, and possibly, depending on where we're at on Friday, possibly be ready to take the test on Tuesday of next week. And we haven't had a test for a while, and we are at the beginning of the 4th quarter. So your first grade is the one that I just put in the grade book for your study guide. So nailing that test would be a good idea. And going back and reviewing your notes and looking at your study guide are kind of important, because we took that 9-day break in between the chapter or in the middle of the chapter. So do that as you will. Still think I'd make a better chaperone than anybody else. How many of you, at least let's go this way, how many of you would take me instead of your own father? Come on, make me feel a little bit better. I'd say, Silas, you're going to take Joe? Really? You take Joe instead of me? No, you take me, because I'm cool for a third wheel. Hate you guys too. Fine, I'm not going. Kylie's like, I would take chemistry. What?
No, I said, what if your date was 10? Wouldn't that be weird? Yeah.
Would it?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll ride along anyway. It would be weird if your date was tanning anyway. Because he's weird. Come on, you would take me before you would take Nick.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Because I would assume he would be very similar to me, but he's your father, so. But he's not your dad. And I gotta assume, because I know Nick a little bit, and I would say he would probably be just as bad as me as a chaperone. So, but if he's your dad, it'd be even worse. Like, nobody likes you. Okay, just teasing. This is being recorded. I shouldn't say things like that. I love all of you equally. Okay, so did we get to this slide the other day and talked about your chances of survival and Kenna had an amputation and she mostly cleaned her bullet wound up. How is the your nub feeling?
It's okay.
Okay, so according to our chart here, having an amputation at the forearm, she has an 86% chance of living. So percent fatal, that means dead. 14% of the people that were amputated at the forearm died. Was it the amputation that killed them?
Infection.
It's infection that kills them. But not having really any understanding of bacteria or germs, things that you can't see don't exist, there's a likelihood that you're going to die if you're shot anyway. Amputation helps, even though the tools that they're using, we talked about the scalpel or the saw. When I'm done amputating Kenna's arm, how do I clean it? Maybe a basin of bloody water, but there's not time for anything in between, and there's certainly no such thing as sterilization. But the alternative to that, if we just remove the bullet and bandage up the wound, you have to think about when a bullet rips through a person, it rips through their clothing first. So if you get shot in the arm, that bullet is not only going into your arm, but it's going to take little fragments of cloth into your flesh with it. And that those little fragments of cloth are dirty and will eventually rot or deteriorate inside your body. So if that wound isn't cleaned out, there's probably a greater chance you're going to die from infection than if you have a limb amputated. And obviously, the story here is that the closer the amputation is to your core, to your torso, the greater chance that you're going to die. And the larger the part of your body that's amputated is, the greater chance that you won't survive. And I think I told you the other day, the only amputation that was zero success was a head amputation. So they found out really quickly that you cannot amputate a head. I think that would be really cool. Like, I have a feeling, I actually hope this is the case, that my body wears out before my brain. Some people get Alzheimer's or dementia, and I think that's horribly sad because their body still works, but their mind doesn't. So I'm hoping that my body gives out before my brain does. And if that happens, I hope the technology exists that they can take my brain and put it on like a robot body so I can still be alive, but only my brain alive. Isn't there a TV show, a cartoon about that? A smart professor has his head put on. Anyway, that'd be good for me, so I'm never going to die. Okay, once people die, we got this new technique called embalming. So, by the way, look at this. The Undertaker here. Look at his advertisement. He's got two guys in coffins standing there. These are dead men. That's how he's advertising his skills. Uh, most Civil War soldiers were not embalmed, but if they were wealthy or their families were wealthy, they could have them embalmed and then shipped home. When a body is killed, when a person is killed or an animal is killed, how long does it take before that body starts to deteriorate? Not very long, almost instantly. So if you see a deer that's been hit alongside the road, if it got hit an hour ago, it starts getting puffy, especially in the summertime when the weather's hot, right? And then pretty soon there's all sorts of flies and on it and maggots, and bodies deteriorate almost instantly. So humans, animals, it doesn't matter what kind, you bury it fairly quickly. So after Civil War battles, there would be men that were paid to go out onto the battlefield and dig trenches and drag bodies into them. Most major Civil War battlefields don't have marked graves, and a lot of times it's because they don't know who the men are that died, and they don't have time to identify them with separate gravestones. So a lot of times they're just mass trenches, sometimes only 3 feet deep, just deep enough to keep animals from trying to dig them up or burrow into them. So the idea of death is really pretty gory and creepy and disgusting. But some guy, and I don't know the science or the history behind it, I know enough about it, but if you die today, you really have two options. Well, you don't have any options, but whoever's burying you has two options. You can be embalmed, which means your body is pretty much going to have preservatives pumped through it, or you can be cremated. If you're embalmed, which is probably the most common type of burial, Like my parents have both said they want to be cremated, so their bodies will be burned and they'll just be a jar of ashes. Uh, I don't know. I think that's probably the way I'll go because I think it's cheaper. And if I'm dead, what do I care? I guess so. Or maybe I want all my money to go with me. Put it in my. And then you jerks would be digging me up. That'd be creepy too. Anyway, so to embalm a body, I don't know who came up with the idea, but it's the same technique that's used today. You literally empty all the fluids out of the body after it's died, the blood and the urine and all the stuff, and you pump in preservatives, sort of like a jar of pickles. Pickles can sit in your refrigerator for months and they're still edible because they got all the vinegar and the preservatives that keep them from getting moldy and rotten. So an embalmed body, and you can see here, it could be returned home even in the heat of the summer. If you lived in New York and your son died in Virginia, you have weeks after that body's been embalmed to get it home and put it in your family plot. So wealthy people could afford to do this. Regular, average, ordinary people, at least at that time, could not. These are embalming tools. It's a pump. So you suck out all the blood and the juice. Today, and I don't know this for sure, but I watch it on television. I believe they cut the arteries in your ankles and they open up holes in other parts of your body and it just basically drains you after a while. And then they stitch those things back up and they fill you with embalming fluid, sort of like changing the oil in a car. If you've ever changed the oil in a car, you pull the plug, you drop the oil, drop the filter, you let all of it drip out, you put the plug back in, and you fill it with nice fresh oil. Except instead of oil, you're using pickle juice. Not literally, figuratively. So an embalmed body doesn't deteriorate. So here we have a picture of an embalmer. He's actually got a tube of juice right into the guy's heart. So it's jabbed right in there. And the heart then doesn't pump, but that's where it distributes all of the juice to the guy's body. So it's kind of a creepy process, but it's kind of the modern version of mummification. You know, in Egyptian times, they would mummify a body before they would bury it or entomb it. We do the same thing today with embalming. So, for the most part, a body that's been embalmed doesn't change over time. And this is creepy and something that nobody really wants to think about. And I don't know this 100% for sure. But I've been told that if you go dig up a corpse, someone that died 10 years ago, in the cemetery and open up the casket, caskets, by the way, are also hermetically sealed, which means there's no oxygen inside them, or the only oxygen is the oxygen that's in there. And things don't deteriorate in an atmosphere where there's no oxygen. That body will look almost exactly the way it did the day it was buried. That's creepy. So it's not like you're going to go to your great grandpa who died before you were born and dig up his body and see what he looked like and find a casket full of skeleton bones. No, you're probably going to see what great grandpa actually looked like. So what I'm saying is don't go over there. It's like Pet Cemetery. Don't go over there and dig anything up. Embalming, Dr. Burnell, free from odor. You got to think that would be an issue. We had a cow one year struck by lightning in the pasture. The boss had sent me out into the pasture to find the beast. So if there was ever a thunderstorm, the next day, usually we would go out into the pasture and make sure that if cows get scared and they take off in a herd, they can just blow through a fence. An individual cow usually won't go through an electric fence, but if there's a whole bunch of them and they're scared by lightning or wind or thunder, they can take off and our herd of cattle really can't be stopped. So got to just check the fences, make sure everything's okay, make sure no trees fell on the fence and knocked it down because you don't want your cows wandering around. I think it was like 3 days after a thunderstorm, boss says go check the cows, and I'm like, there was something not right. There was one missing. And usually they're close enough together you can count them, and if there's supposed to be 74 cows, you can. I can only find 73 or whatever the number was. Boss said, ride around, see if there's any fence down, because that would mean that she would have maybe jumped the fence. And a cow's pretty agile. They can jump over fences if they want to. Usually don't, but they can. I came up over this hill and I looked down and there was this big black blob at the bottom of this canyon with its legs sticking straight up in the air, and she was bloated about 3 times the size of a normal. It was hot. It was like July, and her body was full of air. Usually, when you have a dead animal like that, because it's gonna explode and it's gonna stink for a long, long time, and coyotes and buzzards and stuff will feast on it. But usually, you call a rendering truck and haul the dead animal away. You don't embalm dead cows. Um, we couldn't get to this one with a tractor or a truck, so we had to leave it there. That pasture, the rest of the summer, for a mile around that animal was just the smell of rot. It was so gross. But anyway, so no odor. That's a benefit. Okay, this is a great story. Do you ever think about putting peach tea in your peach colored glass? I bet it would be delicious. You should get some. Peach tea Mio is actually really good. I'm a big fan of Mio, except not the kind with caffeine in it because it jacks me all up and I get all jittery, weird. Can't handle caffeine, Adam. No bueno. Muy mal. Okay, no energy drinks, Christian, especially for you. You're already like all jacked up and weird enough as it is. We don't need you jacked up on caffeine and Red Bull. No, you get weirder. Pretty sure.
Remember? I was at your house and I drank the 3 energy drinks.
Yeah, 3.
Did I see
You can
anything?
have heart problems.
Yeah, your heart will literally explode.
I did.
He doesn't have a heart.
David was
Okay.
there.
It's like the Grinch. Christian. Okay, so here's the story. There's this boat. It's called the USS Merrimack. Now, all ships in the U.S. Navy then and now are called USS, United States ship. I don't know who came up with that. You'd think they could come up with something cooler, but all American warships are USS. This is the USS Merrimack. It's left in the South when the United States is forced to leave the Confederacy when the war breaks out. But when we left ships, so we had more ships than we could actually sail out, we left the worstest ones, but we scuttled them. So we would turn a cannon facing down and blow a hole in the bottom of it. We'd spike the cannon, blow a hole in the bottom of it, and the ship would sink. Since the Confederacy didn't have a navy, their best option for a navy was to resurface the ships that were scuttled, repair them, and send them into service under the Confederate name. So the USS Merrimack becomes the CSS Virginia. If USS is United States ship, what do you think CSS is? Confederate States ship. Super stupid simple. Except they got a plan with this one. Instead of just taking it into dry dock's very simple. So you build a dock, enclose it with walls on 3 sides and a gate on the 4th side, sort of like a garage door. You surface a ship, which I'm not really sure what kind of technology in the Civil War they used to surface the USS Monitor or the Merrimack or the CSS Virginia. By the way, the CSS Virginia and the USS Merrimack are the same ship. It's just renamed when it's captured. I don't know how they surface it, but they float it into dry dock, put it on stilts, then they close the garage door behind the dry dock and pump out all the water. That's why it's called a dry dock. Then they can do repairs around the whole ship. So it's not like it's bobbing around in water almost ready to sink and they're hammering a nail in it. No, they've got time to work with it if there's a dry dock available. Almost all of the ships destroyed by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, most of them were resurfaced, taken into dry dock, and repaired. In fact, one of the two biggest mistakes the Japanese made when they attacked us at Pearl Harbor, they didn't destroy all of our fuel reserves, so we still had fuel at Pearl. They hit some of them, but not all of them, and they didn't destroy the dry dock. If they would have destroyed the dry dock, it would have made it impossible for us to repair those sunken ships without first repairing the dry dock, which could have taken months. So simple mistakes like that. So it's a captured Union ship, but instead of using the regular old wooden warship that the USS Merrimack was, they took her into dry dock and they plated her with iron sides. The idea of a metal warship was silly to most people because when you put a piece of metal on the water, what what does it do? It sinks. When you put a piece of wood on a pond of water, it floats above the ground. So wooden ships were the way to go. However, if you could build a ship out of metal, when cannonballs hit metal ships, they deflect or dent. When a cannonball hits a wooden ship, it cracks or splinters. So if we think back to the ship I talked about really early on, I said Old Ironsides. Does anybody remember the name for a great grand prize? The name of Old Ironsides, the real name? It's going to save me a prize if nobody knows. She was, and still is, the USS Constitution. Why did the British, when they were firing cannonballs at Old Ironsides, when they were firing cannonballs at USS Constitution, why did they think she was plated with iron sides?
Because they used a special type of wood.
Yeah, special type of wood, super strong, several layers thick, and it was green. So it was flexy instead of splintery. So it wasn't made of iron. So this was a fresh, brand new idea. So they build this thing, cover it with iron plates. They don't even know if it's going to float. It's got cannons all the way around it. It's got a steam-powered engine. So there's no need for a sail on this. And sails make pretty easy targets when you're at sea with a wooden ship. So they've totally revolutionized this thing. Whoever came up with this idea was sort of the Elon Musk of the time. Elon Musk comes up with weird, crazy ideas that nobody thinks are going to work, and then he makes them work. And people are like, wow. So we got this huge, hulking, heavy metal ship, and most people are like, there's no way it's going to float. And they got cannons, and then even the most important weapon on board the ship, notice this thing right here. It's called a spar or a ram. This is a 1,500-pound piece of metal. What do you suppose the purpose of this is? If you take this thing and ram it into the side of a wooden ship, and all other ships, almost, are wooden at this time, what's it going to do? It'll poke a hole in it. So this is right below the water line. So their expectation is when they flood the dry dock, and these things right here aren't part of the ship, they're just holding it up. When they open up the gates to the dry dock and flood it with water, their expectation is that it's going to go blue, and it's going to float right to here. Which also means that if an enemy ship wants to attack it, it has a very small profile to hit. It's not a great big ship sticking up out of the water. It's just barely sticking up out of the water. So the CSS Virginia is the world's first ironclad warship. So they don't even really have time to test this thing because it's docked in a place called Norfolk. Just outside of Norfolk in the sea is a place called Hampton Roads. So we're going to see a battle take place. But outside of Hampton Roads, the Anaconda plan is in full effect. So there's at least 3 American warships outside of Norfolk Harbor making sure no ships get in or out. That Anaconda plan, strangle the South. So on May 8th, 1862, they flood the gates and the CSS Virginia set sail. It is slow. It travels at a maximum speed of 5 knots. At sea, you don't measure things in miles per hour. Typically, you measure them in nautical miles per hour. But that'd be the equivalent of about 6 miles per hour. So it's not very fast because it's really heavy. Its turning radius, okay, I know some of you are drivers. Some of you haven't yet had many opportunities to drive. But those of you that are drivers, if you get in Mom's little Prius, okay, a little tiny car, or Dad's Chevy Silverado, which one turns sharper? A little tiny car. You can just go bloop and turn it around. Dad's truck, instead of just flipping around in the middle of the road, you got to turn, back up, turn, back up, turn. It takes 3-point turn it takes to get out. It's like that Austin Power movie when he's stuck in that hallway on that golf cart thing and he only has like 1 inch. Have you seen that? It's really funny. But okay, this thing's turning radius is 1 mile. So if it goes past its enemy, it's 1 mile and 45 minutes to get it turned all the way around. It's not super maneuverable, but this thing is tough. So as soon as it set sail, It recognizes off in the distance an American warship called the USS Cumberland. She set sail directly for the Cumberland. The Cumberland sees smoke belching out of this thing. The Cumberland's a regular old wooden warship, big old sails. Sees smoke, and they're like, "What the frick is this?" They have no idea what's coming at them, and it starts shooting cannonballs, and the cannonballs are just bouncing off of it. And the CSS Virginia goes blam right into the side of the Cumberland with that spar, pokes a big old hole beneath the waterline. Unfortunately for the CSS Virginia, they try to back up, but that spar, that ram, is stuck inside the Cumberland. It won't come out. So both ships are slowly sinking when all of a sudden the Virginia gets a lot lucky and this thing just breaks off. The Cumberland goes down. They're like, woo! They now have the method to defeat the Union blockade. They can defeat the Anaconda with this metal ship. Immediately, they set sail for another American warship that's nearby that just saw this happen, and they've got to be thinking, OMG, what are we going to do? It's called the USS Congress. So the Cumberland has sunk, killing all men on board. The USS Congress sees the Virginia coming at it, and the captain of the Congress says, no thank you, and decides to beach itself. So it goes near the shore because it doesn't want to sink and all of its men die. Beaches itself, which means it runs aground on a sandbar. Now the Virginia, which doesn't have that spar anymore, sits off at a distance and just lobs cannonballs at it. The captain of the Virginia, his name is Buchanan, orders his men to fire hot shot. I've never talked about this before. Hot shot, you take your cannonballs and load them in a fire and get them so they're red hot. What do you think happens when a red hot piece of metal strikes a piece of wood? Fire. So they're using red hot to light this thing up. Finally, the captain of the USS Congress raises a white flag, which means surrender. Captain Buchanan from the Virginia, and by this time it's kind of late in the day on May 8th, he steps out on the deck of his ship with a white flag up, meaning I'll accept your surrender, and somebody on shore shoots him in the face. We don't know if it was a Union soldier or a Confederate that was just confused, but it doesn't kill him. It's just like, dang it, he's like, gotta have my face amputated. Okay, maybe not. But anyway, he gets shot in the face. He orders a retreat. In the meantime, the USS Congress burns most of its men drown, even though they're on a sandbar close to shore. Interestingly enough, most sailors in the Navy in 1862 did not know how to swim, which seems really strange to you and I because, at least in my family, that's one of the first things when our kids were big enough to do stuff. We wanted swim lessons because if we're near a lake or near a pool, I don't want my kids to drown. I need them to be able to paddle themselves to the top. So it's the end of the day. Captain Buchanan is wounded. They head back to Norfolk to the shipyard. The next morning they get up and they've put a new captain in place. His name is Catesby Jones on May 9th, 1862. They set sail out towards Hampton Roads, and they notice off in the distance another American warship called the USS Minnesota. So Catesby Jones, the captain of the Virginia, is like, hey, this has got to be fun. It's like you guys beating up kindergartners. That's not even hard to do, right? I mean, if you don't do that, that would be not nice. But beating up a kindergartner can't be that tough because they're little and not strong, and you guys are big and strong. That's what Catesby Jones is doing here. He's picking on, he's bullying these ships. He's headed straight, and he starts shelling them, and the Minnesota starts shelling back. And Catesby Jones notices something strange off in the distance, right in front of the USS Minnesota. There's what appears to be a metal raft. In fact, they call it a tin can on a shingle. Catesby Jones notices that the Union has brought out their own ironclad. On the second day of existence of ironclad warfare, the Union built its own. They'd been building it. It wasn't like they did it that night. You can't build a warship that fast. But they had built this ship called the Monitor. And the Monitor wasn't an old wooden ship that was covered with iron plates. The Monitor was built to be a metal warship. Again, they didn't know if she would float. When they opened up the dry docks to set her afloat, she sits about 6 inches above the surface of the water. Are either of these boats going to be any good when it comes to waves? No, they're going to get sunk. So you have to have pretty calm seas for either of these boats to be useful. Notice, much different construction. So if we go back and see the Virginia, cannons all the way around. This is a very large ship, very slow. The Monitor is small. And notice the tin can. It looks like a wooden shingle with a tuna can sitting on top of it. It's a brand new piece of technology also. But notice, there's one, you can't see it, two cannon. How can a warship that's small with only two cannon compete with the USS Virginia, or the CSS Virginia, that had, I believe, 16 cannon and a spar? What do you think is special about this tin can? It can rotate. In military terms, we call that a turret. Where do we usually think of turrets existing in the military today? Tanks, right? A tank can be driving this way, and the gun can be firing in any direction. So a tank can be driving away from the battle and firing into the battle. That's what this thing can do. So whereas the CSS Virginia, in order for it to hit its target, it's got to maneuver. And I just told you how slow it is at maneuvering. The Monitor doesn't have to. It can head straight for its target and move its gun depending on where it wants to be. So for something like 4 hours, these two battle, maneuvering into position, neither side able to destroy the other. The CSS Virginia was slowly taking on water, so it had some damage done to some of the welds. It wasn't enough to sink it. They could bilge it out. They could pump it out. Anybody that's ever been on a boat today, if you've gone, you know that your boat takes on water. If it's even just splashing over, and there's a switch on the dash of your boat that says bilge, you flip it on, and it just pumps the water out of the bottom of your boat back into the river or the lake or wherever you're at. So the Virginia has bilges. It's men with pumps. So it's not going to sink. And at some point, the Virginia kind of starts to fall back a little bit out of fear that they might be taking on too much water, but they're still engaged in the battle. A cannonball explodes near the wheelhouse of the Monitor, shooting shrapnel into the slit. So the captain of the Monitor is in this little box in the front. There's a slit that he can see through. Cannonball explodes and shoots stuff into his eyes. He's like, ah! So he orders the Monitor to fall back. Get to a safe position. I got to clean out my eyes or get somebody else in charge because he's temporarily blinded by this. So they fall back. When they do that, the Virginia assumes that the Monitor is in retreat and that they've won the Battle of Hampton Roads. So by the time the captain of the Monitor gets his eyes cleaned out and gets his mind back together and decides to re-engage the Virginia has gone home. So the Monitor believes that the Virginia fell back in retreat and that they've won the day. Who won the first battle of ironclad warships? Nobody. They both thought they won, but nobody won. So what's the significance of May 8th and May 9th, 1862, when it comes to warfare at sea? From that point on, what changes? Does it do you any good to have a wooden navy if your enemy has a metal navy? Most powerful navy on earth at this time is still the British. What do you think they're thinking when they hear news of this battle? Uh-oh, our whole navy is obsolete. There's something better and we better get on it. So everybody begins to change. 369 Union soldiers killed in the Battle of Hampton Roads, most of them on board the USS Cumberland and the USS Congress. 24 Confederates, 7 killed and 17 wounded. So it's the deadliest day at sea in American history, all the way up to Pearl Harbor. So the Battle of Hampton Roads is really a big deal, where we see the first two American ironclads, one Confederate and one American. This is what it might have looked like as they were dueling back and forth. Notice it's barely sitting above the waterline. These are pictures of the two ships, and notice again, they look like they could sink. You can see on the picture to the right here a big area where a cannonball dented the turret, but this thing can rotate 360 degrees. Man sitting on the deck. Huge leap in change for technology. It's like taking imagine how different things would be if you took a 50 caliber machine gun, a Browning 50 caliber machine gun, back to the American Civil War. By the way, both sides by the end of the war had machine guns available to them, but neither side wanted to use them. And there's a specific reason why. It's not because they weren't effective. You could mow down an entire army really quickly. They were effective, but there's a different reason why they wouldn't use them. Again, that's for a later discussion. But wars stimulate technology. Even with the conflict going on between Ukraine and Russia, military observers are learning stuff and figuring out better ways to build better weapons and make killing more efficient. Or maybe even trying to figure out how to make war less lethal. Rather than killing people, just making them stop fighting. Enlist is to join. Contractors, someone who supplies stuff. So today, if before the war in Ukraine broke out, you purchased shares of stock in Raytheon or Boeing or any of the people who supply arms to militaries around the world, those shares of stock are worth more today than they were then. Because Raytheon, they build missiles. Right now they're building more missiles because we've given Ukraine lots of Stinger and Javelin missiles. So we've got to replenish the stockpile and probably send more. So whereas they were making a few before, now they're making a lot because there's an active war going on. So, and hygiene conditions that promote health. So you brush your teeth so that you don't stink, and you wear deodorant, and you shower sometimes. We were talking about how you might have showered or maybe not. Taylor said you did, but do we really trust Taylor? Not really. Okay, so back to the fighting on land. This is George McClellan. He replaced Irvin McDowell. Irvin McDowell is the guy that lost the Battle of Bull Run. He's the guy that was a hesitator. He didn't believe he was big enough and strong enough. And by the way, was he big enough and strong enough to win the Battle of Bull Run? Yes. The reason he lost is because the Confederates came through with that Thomas Jackson guy who was just an all-around stud. So he's now in charge of the Army of the Potomac on the Eastern Front. So this war now is broken up into two parts, the Eastern and the Western Front. Eastern is along the coast and mostly around Richmond. The Western Front is going to be centered around one of the other main objectives for the Confederacy and the Union, for the Union in the Civil War, was to capture the Mississippi River. So this is the big dog in the East. You've got the president, then you've got George McClellan, and then you've got everybody else that answers to those two men. McClellan is a well-trained, well-disciplined organizer of a soldier. His army knows what they're doing. His biggest weakness is very, very similar to Irvin McDowell's. He's a hesitator. He's reluctant to attack. Every time Abraham Lincoln says, press forward with the attack, George McClellan's response is, my army isn't big enough. If McClellan says, I only have 10,000 men and the enemy has 20,000, Abraham Lincoln says, fine, then you can have 25,000. And as soon as he gets 25,000, he tells Lincoln, I heard that the enemy has 30,000. So he's building up this ginormous army, maybe partly out of fear and maybe partly because his information is inaccurate. His army is bigger than what the Confederates have, but he's never quite confident in their ability to attack. So he's got some of the same weaknesses that Irvin McDowell did. We've got General Grant in the South working on taking Tennessee. Now, when the war breaks out, General Grant isn't even in the Army. He had retired from the Army. He'd sort of been forced to quit because there were rumors in the military that General Grant had been drunk and derelict of duty at times. You can't have an officer that is hungover. You can't have an officer that's drinking when there's fighting going on because he's got to be clear-minded and ready to fight. So they kind of gave Grant an ultimatum. This is before the Civil War. They told General Grant, here's the thing. You can either resign and go home, or we can court-martial you and you'll be kicked out of the Army with you'll be discharged dishonorably. General Grant was a soldier through and through. That's all he really loved doing. He did have a wife and a family, but this man loved being a soldier. So for him to quit the military had to be really, really difficult. Grant, by the way, wasn't raised in a similar fashion as General Lee, but Grant did get a position at West Point Military Academy. And when Grant showed up at West Point, interestingly enough, he shows up for the first day, and you got to imagine he was nervous, because your first day of high school, you're going to be nervous. Your first day of college, you're going to be nervous, because you're surrounded by people who you're going to feel know more than you do, or at least they know their way around, and you're lost. So Grant's probably nervous. And he steps up to the registrar's desk and he says, Hiram Grant reporting for duty. And the guy looks at the registrar sheet, and understand they only allow 40 or 50 people in to the West Point Military Academy every year. And the guy goes down his list and he says, I'm sorry, but we don't have a Hiram Grant listed on our registry. And Grant is just devastated. He's like, I've been prepared for this my whole life. I want to be at West Point. Are you sure? And the registrar goes down the list and he says, well, wait a minute. We got a guy on here, Grant, but his name's not Hiram, it's Ulysses. And Grant's like, yeah, that's me. The guy goes, Ulysses Simpson Grant? Yep, that's me, all right. That wasn't his name. But it was him. Somebody screwed up on the paperwork. Ulysses was his middle name. Simpson was his mother's maiden name. So someone got some stuff transposed on his registration stuff. Who did it? Nobody knows for sure. But that was his new adopted name. His real name was Hiram Ulysses Grant. He didn't like his real name because as a child growing up, and by the way, when he was 17 years old, Grant was 5'2". So he was not a big man. And he felt feelings of inadequacy because he was tiny. As a young man heading into West Point, his friends, these are friends, so imagine what his enemies would do, gave him the nickname Huggy. Hiram Ulysses Grant, Huggy. Now, if you see yourself as a tough guy, an army guy, a tough guy, do you really want your nickname to be Huggy? Other guys got cool nicknames. We got Stonewall Jackson and we got Huggy. Nobody's going to take you seriously. So when his initials get changed from HU to US, if you see yourself as a soldierly guy, is there any cooler nickname or any cooler initials than US, United States Grant? He does well at West Point, but he graduates, and I'm making this up because I don't know the numbers, but like 30th out of 50. He's somewhere toward the bottom of the middle. He's not at the top like Lee was, but he is a warrior. He is a fighter. So they go knocking on his door because President Lincoln is like, we need everyone, whoever's, and they're like, well, there's this guy that retired a few years ago, General Grant, but Colonel Grant, but yeah, he had issues, so we don't really want him. And Lincoln goes, where's he at? Go get him. Bring him in. We need all of the leaders we can get. And they're like, well, he does know how to fight. He is good. So he was at home. He tried a couple businesses. He had opened a tannery and failed, much like John Brown. He tried to teach school and he failed. The guy couldn't do anything right, and he was miserable in life. So the army comes knocking on his door because he didn't have a cell phone. Or maybe he had it on vibrate and he wasn't answering. The army comes knocking on his door, and they're like, is Colonel Grant here? And he was hiding in a different room because he saw who it was. And he's like, tells his wife, tell him to go away. I don't want to talk to him. And his wife opens the door. He's like, what can I do for you, gentlemen? And they're like, we need to speak to Colonel Grant. And she's like, well, and Grant's like, tell him to go away. They need to leave. I don't want to go with them. He's almost like a baby throwing a tantrum here. And Mrs. Grant, she's like, well, he's not here. And they're like, we need to see him. President Lincoln needs to speak with him. We got a letter from President Lincoln. And she goes, come on in, gentlemen. And Grant was like, no. I'll go get him. So they bring Grant out, and they're like, Colonel Grant, sir, we've been given orders to offer you a commission as the general of the armies. We want to give you an army. And Grant's like, no, you kicked me out. They're like, we need you, sir. This is war. We need you. So Grant was pulled out of retirement that he was kind of forced into because we needed him. He immediately takes control of an army in the west, so along the Mississippi River, and starts kicking tail. Fort Henry and Fort Donelson are two Union victories. General Grant is a winner. He's not a hesitator. He's a bulldog. Go get him. So immediately begins to build a reputation, and men like fighting for him because we all want to fight for a winner. He allows boats to reach as far south as Alabama, so his job is to take the Mississippi River, which, by the way, do you think Grant's job is as hard as what McClellan's job will be? Where do you think the bulk of the Confederate soldiers are going to be, on the Mississippi or protecting their capital? It makes sense that it would be easier to capture the Mississippi. So he fights at the Battle of Shiloh. It's the fiercest fighting so far of this war. At the Battle of Shiloh, there are 13,000 out of 65,000 Union soldiers are killed or wounded. This is kind of big. Takes place April 6th, 1862. So at the same time as the Battle of Hampton Roads, the same time as those Ironclads are fighting at sea, General Grant has his hands full in Tennessee. Shiloh was actually the name of a little tiny church in the countryside. That's where this battle gets its name. There's 40,000 Confederate troops under the command of a guy named Albert Sidney Johnston. Albert Sidney Johnston will be the highest ranking officer on either side killed in battle in this war. Albert Sidney Johnston gets shot in the leg. Johnston, sitting on his horse, gets shot in the leg. He's wearing tall boots. He realizes he's been shot, but it's the middle of a battle, so his men, his adjutants, are like, General, you've been shot. We've got to get you back to safety and get you to the hospital. He's like, I'm fine. Don't worry about me. And a few hours later, the dude just falls off his horse deader than a hammer. They pull off his boot. It was full of blood. The guy bled to death, but wouldn't leave the scene. He's a tough guy, but Confederate general. He's replaced by P.T. Beauregard. So Albert Sidney Johnston attacks Ulysses Grant. After the first day, there were 30,000 Confederates and 40,000 Union troops. After the first day of fighting, Grant's men said, General Grant, we need to retreat. And Grant says, no, I propose we wait and attack at daylight and whip them. What Grant knows and what his men don't know are probably the key here. Grant knows that there's another Union general named Don Carlos Buell that's on his way with 30,000 reinforcements. He shows up in the middle of the night. So the next morning when P.T. Beauregard wakes up, he notices that there's almost twice as many Union soldiers as there are Confederate soldiers. Now he's on his heels, and Ulysses Grant and Don Carlos Buell attack. They force the Confederates into an area called a sunken road. We know that the low spot on a battlefield is the worst position to be in. The Confederates called it a hornet's nest. Not because there was a hornet's nest there, but because there were so many bullets whizzing past their head, it sounded like angry hornets buzzing by them. So this is a nasty, nasty, bloody battle. Zipping bullets sound like angry hornets. It was a hornet's nest in there. Now, at this battle, Grant was blamed by his men because they lost a lot of men. Grant's men claimed that he was drunk and missed the first few hours of fighting. He was sleeping it off in his tent. So Grant's enemies in the Union Army go to President Lincoln, and they're like, Lincoln, you got to get rid of this jackwagon. He's drinking, and he's the reason we lost so many men. And Abraham Lincoln says, but he fights. I like him. He's going out and winning, where George McClellan is too hesitant to attack anybody. So they're like, well, he can't be drinking. And President Lincoln says, what do you think he's drinking? Well, he drinks whiskey, sir. And Lincoln says, well, then deliver him the finest case of whiskey that I've got, because he fights. So General Grant immediately builds up a reputation of being a tough guy. He's not very big. He's not assuming, but he fights. I can't spare this man. So even though some are calling for him to be removed from the army because he has issues, he's good. We've got to keep him. Maybe the comparison, Aaron Rodgers wasn't very nice to the Green Bay Packers at the beginning of the season last year. So why do they keep him around? Because he's good. They have to deal with him. He's kind of I'm not a huge fan, but I'm not a hater. He's kind of a baby, it seems like, once in a while. But they just gave him like a huge raise, and they're going to keep him around for the rest of his career because he's good. Can Tom Brady be a little bit of a baby if he wants to be? Yes, because he's good. When Tom Brady says, pay me more, do they have a choice? Not really. We need him. He fights. That's kind of the attitude. We also see a lot of photography in the Civil War. How much time do I have? A few minutes? 9 minutes? Okay, I'll finish in 4. This is the first war, and I've talked about this before, that's photographed. The most famous photographer in the Civil War is a guy named Matthew Brady. Civil War photography was difficult. It's not like whipping out your phone and taking a selfie. It's not quite that easy. It takes at least a wagon load of equipment, and when you take a photograph, you use caustic chemicals that will eat the fingerprints off of your skin, and you paint glass plates with these chemicals that, when exposed to light, reveal dark shadows. That's what photographs literally are. So it's difficult because, can you imagine bouncing on your way to a battlefield where there really isn't a road in a wagon without shock absorbers, full of glass plates and dangerous chemicals? So oftentimes Civil War photographers like Matthew Brady would show up to battles after the battles had already taken place. So we know today that when we look at pictures of supermodels in magazines, that they're not exactly real, that they can Photoshop them, that if a photographer was hired to put me on the cover of a magazine in swim trunks, they could make me look not fat with a six-pack and Kylie's hair. I would look good with Kylie's hair. I could do it. But they can do that. So even in the Civil War, they didn't have computer software to Photoshop pictures. But when we're looking at this picture, this is an example, and I don't know, but it could be fake. Because Matthew Brady might have showed up 2 days after the battle, and you clean up the bodies right away because they begin to deteriorate quickly and they start to stink. So Brady might have showed up and be like, dang, I missed it again. And there aren't really any action shots because it takes seconds for pictures to expose. It's not like click, click. No, you uncover the cap and you let the light expose the chemicals on that glass plate. It takes a while. So it could be that Brady got to the battle late and he's like, you, and you, come over here and lay on the field like you've been shot. And sometimes they would use pig blood even on them to make it look like they were bleeding. So we don't know. When you look at a picture of the aftermath of a Civil War battle, you can't be 100% sure if it's real or if it's posed, because sometimes they had to pose them. First aerial photo. How do you get an aerial photo with airplanes not existing until the Wright brothers in the 1920s? A balloon. So you get way up in the sky, which is kind of cool, except you make a really easy target up there, so I wouldn't want to be in the balloon corps. First color photo in 1861. The Civil War is the first conflict documented through photos, so we can see pictures now instead of people's descriptions. Big, heavy, bulky equipment. This one's probably real because you got a line of bodies, so they drag them into a line, and then they would dig a trench on one side and pull the bodies in. Here you see the aftermath, all these guns laying around, and there was a trench dug for defensive purposes. Trench warfare is a really, really smart way of fighting. We have a description of George McClellan. He's hesitant to attack. Hesitant. McClellan is hesitant. That's going to be important on Friday when we have class. His boys were trained well, and they were good at running drills. He's a pretty boy that doesn't get along with Abraham Lincoln very well, and he's hesitant to fight. That's all you need to know right now about George McClellan. We've got Grant. He's a tough guy. He says, find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can, and keep moving on. If you're a soldier in the Civil War, who you want to fight for, General McClellan or General Grant? I like winning. Now, which one do you have a better chance of surviving fighting for, General McClellan or General Grant? Probably McClellan, because he's not even going to take you into battle. Whereas Grant, he's the honey badger of the Civil War. This guy's like, go get him and keep moving. Then we got this guy. This is Grant's right-hand man. Look at him. His hair's a mess. He doesn't care. He's just like Grant. He's a Union general, does whatever Grant says, believes in him. He's going to become an even bigger player later. After the Battle of Shiloh, this guy said the scene on this field would have cured anybody of war. How can you cure somebody of war? What does he mean by that? Shiloh is so bad that anybody that sees it is never going to want war again. He also says war is hell. That's a pretty simple description. But the dude doesn't shave, doesn't he? Looks like he combed his hair with a pillow. Looks grouchy. That's exactly the kind of leader that I want to follow. We'll finish up on Friday with David Farragut, and then we'll get into one of the nastiest battles in American history on Friday. And we'll get close to finishing up the chapter at that point. That's David Farragut. So I've got a pretty good story about him also. Any questions? Okay.